Welcome to my free writing course. My name's Mahsuda. Today I'm going to give you 3 tips for editing fiction. And you know we're doing editing today because I've got my editing earrings. Now, important thing to note about editing that it's going to be different for every single writer. So what I'm giving you today are 3 tips that might help you in the process. But if you find anything in these 3 tips that really don't help you, then you are more than welcome to ignore. And that goes for any writing advice you ever get. So my tip number 1 is to leave a break between drafts. Now you may be at the point where you've come to the end of a first draft or you come to the end of a couple of drafts. Wherever you are in the editing process, it's always good to leave a break between when you finished and when you start again. The reason for that is if you leave a break between drafts, your brain has time to reset. If you rush from draft to draft to draft, you get to the point where you know every single sentence that you're about to read, you can't see your work objectively in any way, and that makes the editing process even harder than it already is. So if you can, leave a break. Now I realise that's very difficult sometimes if you've got a deadline. So even if you can put away your work for a couple of days and work on something completely different, that will give your brain time to reset. The thing to remember when you do go back to that draft and you reread it is to read it as a reader first before you read it as a writer. And when you're reading as a reader, you'll notice things like the plot doesn't quite work, you're missing certain things out of character development. When you get to editing as a writer, you can look more finely at the line details, and that's something we're going to look at more in tip number 3. So how can you make it easier for yourself to read your work as a reader? One thing I like to do is to change the font and change the line spacing, because then suddenly your work feels like it belongs to somebody else. If you can, printing off your work and reading it in a relaxed environment rather than at your desk can make it feel more like a reading experience than an editing experience. And what I like to do during that reading process is to not do lots of edits as I go along, but just to have a notebook on the side and write notes as I'm reading. Then I'm not breaking up the process of the reading experience. Now, it's important to remember that different people edit in different ways. You might go through your first draft really quickly, just completely let it out and see where it goes. You may have written a really detailed plot with scene-by-scene descriptions, in which case you might go through that first draft really slowly and really deliberately. You might edit as you go. Although a lot of people recommend you don't edit as you go, that's not necessarily a bad thing if it works for you. The problem with editing as you go is you can get stuck on certain parts of your work, in which case it gets really difficult to get to the end of a draft. So experiment and find out what process works for you. My tip number 2 is to edit in stages. Now, what do I mean by stages? Like I said before, you might want to do a whole first draft straight away and just get everything out as you go along. But for each draft of your novel, of which there may be many, you might want to focus on a different element. So for my first novel, The Things We Thought We Knew, I did 14 full drafts. For my next novels, I think it's come down a little bit, but not much. But what I like to do is to focus on something different on each draft. So for my first draft, I try and get as much of the story out as possible. That's what I call getting the skeleton of your story out onto the page. And I never used to have a plot outline, but I do now because I find it stops me going off on tangents, which is really important. And I've got a whole video about plotting a novel if you want to go and look at that. For my next draft, I usually like to flesh out the details of the chapters, flesh out the details of the scenes, flesh out characters. Then what I do after that is go back and kind of repeat the process. And in my final drafts, I like to use a particular technique to stop the writing getting stagnant. What I do is I write out of sequence. So I segment the whole novel into different sections, and instead of going from beginning to the end all the time, for some of those drafts I'll go out of order. So I'll do section 22 and then section 4 and then section 34. It keeps me interested and also helps me focus on whether that section is working on its own. And then for the next edit, I really like to trim down and do line edits, really focusing on what I would call sculpting the book, which leads me nicely on to tip number 3. So my tip number 3 is really a collection of line editing tips. First of all, avoid repetition of words or actions. So if you write, "Yes, she said," nodding, you either need the yes or you need the nodding. You're repeating the same idea twice. Now that's a micro example of repetition, but you might find that you've repeated an idea in your book. So you might have explained that somebody is a certain way early on in a chapter and then try to repeat that explanation later on, in which case you only need one. So decide which example works best. Another tip is to try and not use too many adjectives. Now, if you had an education like me growing up, you were taught to put as many adjectives into your writing as possible. What most writers are told when they're trying to become a professional writer is to take out all those adjectives. And I'm going to give you an example of why that is. Here's a sentence that is full of adjectives. She was tall and athletic with thick, muscly tanned arms that bulged beneath her lime green Adidas t-shirt. Now that sentence is absolutely crammed with adjectives. You as a writer might have thought, if I put all those adjectives in, I'm going to really paint a picture of who this person is. I'm going to give you an example of where I've trimmed down those adjectives. Her muscles bulged beneath her lime t-shirt. Now, I've taken out most of the adjectives from that sentence, but hopefully you've still got the same impression of what that character's like. She's athletic, she likes lime green t-shirts. Another tip is to show, don't tell. Now, this is a tip you may have heard lots as a writer, and instead of trying to break that whole concept down for you, I've done a whole video about show, don't tell. Another line editing tip is to avoid cliches. Things like the white fluffy clouds, cold as ice, as dark as the night, and so forth are cliches. And why they're cliches is because they've been repeated so often that they almost lose their meaning. And when a reader comes across a cliche, they almost don't register what you're trying to say with your writing. What they're reading becomes vague, and what you really want as a writer is to make everything specific. So you could twist cliches on their head, such as changing the white fluffy clouds to the black jagged clouds. That's creating a completely different image in your reader's head, and actually a far more specific and memorable image as well. Keep your sentences simple. In fact, try and cut your sentences down to the bare minimum of what you are trying to say. That doesn't mean you don't have room to be poetic and to paint a picture. But like I've said in many of my previous videos, examine your sentences to see if they are either moving the story forward or revealing something about character. If they're doing something else and you really think it's of value to your whole story, then do keep it in. But if they're not, it's going to slow your story down. So this is the point where you can really be ruthless with yourself and cut out the things that are not necessary to your story. Also, when you're editing a scene, see if there's a good balance between action, description, dialogue, internal thought, and flashback. You don't want to be too heavy on any of those. Preferably try and spread them out throughout the scene and weave in the different information. Now, I'm not the type of person who believes in shoulds in life, but I do believe there is one should in writing. And that is, you should not bore your reader. Make sure that your writing is constantly making the reader ask questions, constantly planting images and emotions, and make sure you are planting seeds that will eventually grow in your story. Now, I'm not saying that any of the editing process is easy. In fact, editing is notoriously difficult, but I do think that if you find the right process that works for you, you'll get to the point where you actually really love editing. I used to hate editing. I would avoid it like the plague. But now I've got to the point where I get really excited about going back and editing a piece. And that really is because I've learnt the process that works for me. So do what works for you. This was part of my free writing course. If you would like to see more of these videos, then you can subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like to support what I'm doing, then you can buy me a coffee on the Ko-fi link below. Thank you for joining me, and remember, every writing journey is different, so find the path that works for you.